All right, so we're going to jump over to the Internet Weather Report here and just give a little bit of an idea of some of the things that we've observed over the last week or so. First item here, scan probes on port 873 TCP. This is rsync. This isn't actually new activity. It's I'm showing 240 days worth of activity here, but I'm not sure that we've reported on this before. I know we've talked about rsync perhaps sometime a long time ago. You know, rsync is basically a tool to be able to synchronize files between two systems. It's oftentimes used for a backup tool or to be able to provide basically redundant systems. There's a good possibility that some activities are taking place across the internet. It's actually a single source in China that's doing most of this probing activity. They're also probing a variety of other ports. I didn't try to enumerate those here, but a number of other ports that would be indicative of trying to perform penetration activities against systems. So keep an eye out. If you are using rsync over the internet, you'll want to pay attention to that. And even if it's not intended to be on the internet, you might want to make sure that it's not exposed to the internet.
The timing of that is interesting because as I recall, I think back in September or so, there was a vulnerability in rsync on some load balancers that I don't know exactly what the time frame was that scanning started, but it looked like it might have been back in that vicinity.
Yep, that's a good possibility. You know, oftentimes these activities start up by advent of a vulnerability that's been reported. In this case, it appears that they've found some reason to continue that activity. So, good point, Jim. Next item here is scan probes on port 9200 TCP. This is associated with Elasticsearch. We had been sort of speculating what the motive might be behind this in our previous reports. We're showing 120 days of activity, and it was actually in the beginning of March that we saw sort of an uptick in this activity. Well, it turns out Jordan Wright had done a couple of blogs on this particular topic. One where he was, and this is actually just from yesterday, May 11th, where he had been tracking over 60 days watching hackers attack Elasticsearch. In fact, he had found a vulnerability that perhaps is associated with this particular activity. And you had taken a little bit of a look at this. Any comments?
Really?
Yeah, really.
No. There's like there's remote code execution vulnerabilities, and then there's just a field there's like, please place the code in that you would like us to execute to run across this search. And at some point fairly recently, they're like, oh, maybe we should put that into the Java sandbox, which is basically a discredited sandbox. It's very clear it's a thing that's easy to break out of. So you know, it's a convenient feature, but like literally you provide the code that you want it to run, and it runs it. That's the vuln.
Right.
So,
you know, to have a feature like this in a closed environment, you know, we talk oftentimes about having layers of defense, and if your only layer of defense is a sandbox, it's probably not a good defense.
It's a very good point that this feature is totally fine if you are running the code as kind of a local thing.
Right.
But by default, it wasn't installed on a local thing. It listened on all interfaces on port 9200, and then shockingly now people are scanning everything on the internet on 9200. So hopefully this is getting managed.
Yeah, and there is the potential, you know, like we saw with the bash vulnerability, that where there is the potential that perhaps there is a front-end interface to an Elasticsearch system. Perhaps they're not scanning port 9200 here, but it could be a web interface that would potentially expose this vulnerability as well, I presume.
Yeah. That's probably going to happen and not be a good day. So I would actually say it'd be a very good idea. Always thinking about actionable intelligence. Monitor your web logs. Look for the sort of patterns that only happen on stuff that gets forwarded to Elasticsearch.
Right.
You know, look for this stuff in your architecture. You know, this is why you really want to have an inventory of what code is being exposed. I always like to talk about the most million important lines of code that are being exposed to attackers that would cause problems across the global internet. It should be the same for your organization. It's okay to use open source. Everyone does, and it's really good stuff. But when there's problems like this, especially as you say, you know, what you're doing is doing what John Lambert at Microsoft calls not thinking in terms of lists, but thinking in terms of graphs. It's not just what's exposed on 9200, it's what's exposed on 80 that forwards stuff to 9200. Because that is how you find really good attacks.
Yeah. good from an attacker's point of view.
Well, yes.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
The guy Jordan Wright, who did the blog post that you were looking at a minute ago, also released a honeypot, elastic
right.
honey, that I'm going to throw up on one of our honeypots and see what we can get out of that. That sits on 9200 and pretends to be Elasticsearch.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah, very cool. We'll look forward to some results from that. Next item here is we have flows, packets, and bytes that were off the charts, relatively speaking, on port 53 UDP. That's DNS. We talked a lot about DNS today. Mm-hmm. We're showing 30 days of activity, and really what this amounts to, this was actually a reflection attack, and it turned out that this was a reflection using NTP. So the source port is 123. The destination port happened to be 53.
Can't
so they were
just
targeting
pick one?
Can't they just pick one? So this is a case where I don't know if they were actually targeting a DNS server in this particular case, but I thought it'd be a good example to show. So this particular graph, same timeline. The blue line is basically showing the port 53 target, and the red line showing the source port 123 activity. You can see there's a close correspondence in the volume of activity in that time period. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, at the top of the list here, we have port 80. Look at that, port 80 is through the roof. That's rather unusual here. And probing, by the way, this is looking for sources that are making connections to lots of different addresses on a common port or a handful of ports. And so we track that activity as probing or scanning activity on the internet, and it helps us to identify this sort of activity. Port 80 is normally probed quite a bit, usually shows in the top 10, but not at this proportion. So this is a little bit of an anomaly, a big anomaly that we'll take a little closer look at. Followed by port 22 TCP, 23 TCP, no surprises there, port 445. Can you believe it? Still conficker on the internet. and not a small amount of it. And then followed by port 3389, remote desktop protocol, 1433, that's Microsoft SQL database, 8080 TCP looking for proxies, 53 UDP looking for those DNS servers, and 1900 UDP looking for SSDP, which is both of those used in reflection attacks. It turns out these probes on port 80 TCP aren't actually probes, or they appear not to be probes. They appear to be actually a sort of a SYN flood against a block of addresses. So it's actually about like a /23 address block, and so you see lots of flows from each of these source addresses being thrown to those on the course of tens of millions of those, of course. So it appears to be a SYN flood against a block of addresses that are located in China that appear to be associated with video game hosting. So it appears that perhaps somebody has a bit of a beef against them. We don't have intimate details of that, however. Interesting. We'll call it false positive in the class of probing activity. Next one here is probes on port 23 TCP, that's telnet, and we do have an increase in that. We're showing 90 days of activity here, and over the last week or so you can see that there's been an uptick in that activity. We're going to take a look at that in terms of the number of sources doing that probing in a couple of minutes here. And then looking at the, in fact, in a couple of seconds, most sources doing the probing, port 23 at the top of the list. It's clearly far and above the others and moved up a couple of places relative to last week, followed by port 445 TCP. And then we also have some other ports. We're going to just take a look at port 23 and port 17788 a little bit more closely. And then on port 23, looking at this number of sources that are doing that probing over the last 90 days, clear uptick on that. That's a strong indicator of botnet activity. You don't have a bunch of addresses doing the same thing at the same time for no reason. This growth is a little more gradual than we typically see for a botnet, so there may be some pieces or parts to it that are a piece of this activity, but clearly probing out for those devices. And then last item here, scan sources on port 17788 UDP. You know, we had identified this as being very indicative of BitTorrent activity, and it appears to be associated with some pirated video content basically being distributed toward China. The reason I brought this up again, we've reported on this a couple of times, is that it appears that whatever activity here, they had a little bit of a disruption in service, and that seems to be a pretty typical scenario. Even the folks that are doing bad things have these reliability issues that they have to deal with. So